Hello, this Dating the Old Testament video is on the book of Joel. Let me share my screen. Okay, the picture there we have of Joel is a locust because Joel starts off the book with a locust plague, and that really takes up the first half of the book. Now, Joel is one of the most difficult books in the Bible to date. The suggestions for date of writing range from the 9th century down to the 4th century BC, and there's not a real clear division between more liberal scholars saying one and more conservative scholars saying the other. And in kind of because of that, it may not be especially important where the date is. The context of Joel is he's describing a locust plague that was very severe, and there's an analogy between that and the day of the Lord. The book of Joel is a short book, and that's one of the reasons it's difficult to date. There's just not a whole lot in there that can be used as a clue. And the clues which we do have are a little bit conflicting. So it makes it hard. So I kind of like to treat it as a puzzle. And although I said it may not be especially important, I think it's still useful to go through because it can help us a little bit in how we think about some of the things in understanding a book in the Bible. I've shown this slide before where the books of the Bible in the Hebrew Bible are divided between the law, the prophets, and the writings. And Joel is there among the minor prophets, and he's sandwiched in between Hosea and Amos. Now, Hosea and Amos are the early writing prophets. And so to put Joel in there between them would be one clue that Joel might be one of the early books. So that would be a clue for an early date of writing. Now, in the book of Joel, there aren't any kings or other public figures mentioned. Often at the very first or second verse of a prophetic book, it tells you who was the king. If Joel had done that, then that would have given us a good clue as far as a pretty convincing clue as far as when the book was written, but it doesn't do that. It just starts by saying, the word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. No kings or other public figures mentioned. However, maybe that's an argument for a late date, for a post-exilic date after 538 BC, because the book does address elders and priests, but it doesn't talk to any kings or governing officials. And that's what we would call an argument from silence, and an argument from silence isn't necessarily the best kind of argument, but it is something. We do have this, which is pretty convincing about this verse, which says, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat was an earlier king of Judah, and he reigned 873 to 848. But that's such an early date that that won't help us very much. It just tells us that it was sometime later than that very early date. But there's also in that same passage this phrase, because they have scattered them among the nations, scattered my people Israel among the nations. And that sounds like it might be exilic, when the people were scattered into exile. But in this book, Israel is not in exile during the book. So maybe that's a hint that they were scattered into exile, but now the exile is over. That would be a second hint that the book may be post-exilic. And Jerusalem has a wall. It's just a wall that the locusts climb on in chapter 2, verse 9, but it is a wall. So that would tend to indicate that this was after Nehemiah repaired the walls, which was well after the return from exile. It was about 445 BC. And if this book of Joel was written after 445 BC, then that would point to it being one of the last books in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, that was written. There are a couple nations that are mentioned in there, and this kind of just serves to confuse things. Because the first few, Tyre and Sidon and Philistia, were kind of prominent in the early days of Israel, especially the Philistines. And those people were enemies, and they sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks. But no, the Greeks are really late on the scene. So The mention of countries like Philistia tend to point to an early date, whereas mention of the Greeks tends to point to a very late date. And so it's a little bit conflicting. But I tend to think that this is maybe a little bit more evidence for a later date yet again, just because, the region of Philistia could still have been considered to be there even later on in the Old Testament period, but the Greeks really weren't really on the scene until a little bit later in the time period. Now, here's something that I like to do that can be helpful, I think, in understanding something like this. Often in the Bible, there will be different writers who will talk about the same sorts of things, and if they have the same themes and whatnot, that's no big surprise. But sometimes they use particular wording, which the wording is so identical or so similar that it indicates that one of them read the other. Um, and an example is in Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:3, where they both say, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." Both Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:3 say that. They were both written around about 700 BC. Now, Joel says, "Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears." So Joel reverses it. He doesn't go swords to plowshares, he goes plowshares to swords. So the question is, who read who? Did Isaiah and Micah read Joel, or did Joel read Isaiah and Micah? Like I said, those first two are written in 700 BC. I think it is more likely that Joel read those two, mostly because, if for no other reason, it's 2 to 1. I think it's more likely that one person would have reversed the formula than two would have done it. And here's one more. In Jonah 3:9, the king of Nineveh says, "Who knows, God may turn and relent." And then a few verses later, Jonah says, "For I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster." Oops. Now, Joel 2:13-14 says, "Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster. Who knows whether he will not turn and relent?" Well, we have to be careful because the phrase about God being gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love is kind of a stock phrase, which is used in a lot of different books in the Bible. You can't use that to necessarily prove anything. But the part about who knows whether he will not turn and relent, in Jonah, the king of Nineveh says that, and in Joel, Joel says it. Well, we can be pretty sure that the king of Nineveh did not read the Hebrew prophet Joel. But if Jonah was a book which had made it into the canon, so to speak, the canon as it existed at that time, then Joel may have read Jonah. So I think that's a clue that Joel at least was later than some of the earlier writing prophets. So in conclusion, I've got Joel down as a very late book. It was written between 445 and 400 BC. And people who've watched the other videos that I've done may remember that I've tended to lean toward earlier dates for most of the books. So this is one where I've actually gone a little bit the other way and come to a conclusion that it's more likely to be a later date. However, I have to say that this conclusion is not as convincing as usual. It's built on an accumulation of rather small hints. But that's what I have to say about the book of Joel. And I thank you for watching, and we'll plan to come back soon with another